Please welcome to the stage, Ann O'Brien, Executive Director, CFA Society, San Francisco.
I hope you enjoyed your meal. It's a pleasure to host this annual event every year, and particularly this year as we celebrate 90 years. Echoing Bay's and Paul's remarks, we're proud that the CFA Society San Francisco has sustained 90 years leading the investment industry in the Bay Area, and that's through the commitment, innovation, and the hard work of member volunteers, staff, and sponsoring organizations. Tonight, the 500 plus of you here represent the breadth and longevity of our industry. We have young student volunteers just preparing to enter the profession, alongside some of our legacy members who have been with the Society for over 60 years. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote presenter for the evening. Dr. Phillip Tetlock is the Annenberg University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with appointments at the Wharton School and the School of Arts and Sciences. He is co-leader of the Good Judgment Project, a multi-year forecasting study, and co-author of the best-selling business book, Super Forecasting: The Art and Science of Prediction. In Super Forecasting, Dr. Tetlock offers a masterwork on prediction, drawing on decades of research and results of a massive government-funded forecasting tournament. Researchers aggregated predictions from tens of thousands of ordinary people, identifying super forecasters whose outperformance eclipsed even the analysts in the intelligence community. Super forecasting techniques are now being used by government agencies, non-governmental agencies, and private companies across the globe. And now you have the chance to become a super forecaster right here. CFA Society San Francisco is a lead sponsor, along with 20 other CFA societies in the Americas, in a year-long, worldwide super forecasting challenge of our own that all of you are encouraged to join in. There are cards on the table detailing how to join. Dr. Tetlock will talk about it a bit as well. Be sure to take a card and join the challenge. And now, I invite and welcome Professor Phillip Tetlock to the stage.
Thank you for that really kind introduction. If I were in the audience right now, and I saw something like super forecasting in the title slide of a presentation, I think that my hype antennae would pop out of my head and start vibrating. You should be suspicious of a term like that. So I'm going to start with a bit of a disclaimer and explain a little detail what exactly I mean when I use the term super forecasting. I'm not referring to people who have super beings who have uncanny foresight. What I have in mind are the intelligent professionals, mostly professionals, who volunteered to serve in forecasting tournaments that we ran, mostly under the auspices of the U.S. intelligence community. And they displayed a superhuman power, borderline superhuman power, which is a willingness to admit mistakes. They were willing to keep score. They were willing to submit to objective scoring rules. And in the process of doing that, they started to acquire a skill. Subjective probability forecasting in messy real-world settings is a skill that can be cultivated and is worth cultivating. And these forecasting tournaments have repeatedly demonstrated that this is indeed the case. And I will make that case here today. What does it mean to become better calibrated subjective probability forecaster? Well, great poker players, people like Aaron Brown, the former chief risk officer at AQR, or Annie Duke, people you may have heard of in popular books. They sometimes say, well, you can tell the difference between a world-class poker player and a talented amateur because the world-class player knows the difference between a 60-40 bet and a 40-60 bet, or maybe 55-45, 45-55. They become more nuanced, they become better calibrated, they distinguish more degrees of maybe reliably. You don't learn how to become a well-calibrated forecaster by doing the sorts of things pundits on TV typically do and making vague verbiage forecasting and saying, oh, there's a distinct possibility of a recession in 2020 and there's a good chance of such and such. Nobody has the faintest idea how to translate that into a meaningful probability scale and to calibrate risk on the basis of that. And I'll show you that later in a minute. If you want to learn how to do it, if you want to learn how to become better calibrated, you want to learn whether when you say events are 80% likely, whether they happen about 80% of the time or they happen about 60% of the time. If you think that there is some value to you professionally and financially in acquiring that skill, this is something I think you should give some consideration to. Now, our plan was, is my colleague Warren Hatch, who is actually a certified super forecaster and works with Good Judgment Incorporated, which is the private sector spinoff from the Good Judgment Project, which worked with the intelligence community. Warren is going to come up and he's going to show you how to link into the forecasting tournament and make an actual forecast. And we'll do that. That exercise will take a few minutes, and then I will segue back into my presentation. Okay?
Let me just click. We'll just go straight. Oh, I do. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having us here tonight. It's a lot of fun to see some familiar faces and be part of this 90th anniversary celebration. And I just want to say too is that as tough as going through the training to become a super forecaster was, it was that much tougher to get my CFA charter, and that was really good ground to become super forecaster. And I'll wager a lot of the people in this room are also super forecasters, and so why don't we find out a little bit now by doing a forecast. And so what I'd like you to do is go to that URL, superforecasting.com. And you should see, when you get there, a box to enter your forecast to this question. Before the 1st of August of this year, will the Federal Reserve raise its target range for the federal funds rate? And we want to just ask you to put in a probability. 0 if you think not a chance, 100% if you say absolutely, but probably somewhere in between. A probability estimate that you think that will occur between now and August. Does that make sense okay? Is everyone able to get in, I hope? And then when you get in, just click Submit, and you'll see this little mesmerizing box, rotating box. And then in a moment, I'll click a button, and we'll see what the median forecast is. And we'll get the wisdom of this crowd on that question right here, right now. And this is, I think, the largest live forecasting we've done by a wide margin. So fingers crossed it works. And maybe just take half a more minute, and then I'm going to press the button. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to click the button, and it'll show up on your screens in a moment, but I can tell you right now that the range goes from 0 to 937%, so there's a glitch there. We call that overconfidence. But happily, we can go to the median, and that'll strip it out, and hopefully our tech guys back in the home office will get rid of it too. But the median is 40%, so that's the number right now that we want to focus on. Is that the wisdom of the crowd in this room, 40% probability that the Fed is going to raise rates between now and August. So one of the key things about thinking like a super forecaster is making updates and sharing information and testing your own beliefs. I'd like to do that right now for just a couple of minutes. Think of your forecast, think of a reason you made your forecast, and we'll just take like 2 or 3 minutes, talk to your neighbor, compare your reasoning, compare your forecast, see if it's the same, see if it's different, consider whether you should update your forecast, and then we're going to do an update, okay? So let's just take maybe 3-4 minutes. Okay, so that's been about 4 minutes, and hopefully you got a little bit of a chance to exchange some views, but let's now, if you will, suspend the conversation for now. There'll be a chance to pick it up again over the cocktail hour, the soiree later on. But please now, if you would.
Control of the room is a challenge.
Yeah, this is, yeah, that's a bigger challenge. So, okay. Thank you for that. So if you would now, go to your devices and you'll see the same screen, and please put in a new number. It could be the same number if you don't change your view. If you've changed your view, please put in a new number. And we'll take about 1 minute, please. 1 more minute to put your numbers in. I'm sorry? Getting one now. You can see him coming in. Yeah, I'll do it here. Okay, so can pipe down for just a moment, if you would, and we'll. And I'm just going to share the results and then hand back to Phil. So just have your attention, please. Thank you. And so the results are in, and the median was. Here, I'm going to click the button, and you'll see it in your devices in a moment. And it went from 40% to 25%. So that was a pretty big drop. That the Fed will raise rates. Now, just one last thing is that this particular question is going to be on the CFA challenge. So if you sign up on the card that you have here, you'll see this very same question tomorrow morning. And one last thing is that this is also a question that's being posed to the super forecasters, a version of it, and the number that they have is actually 60%. So there's a big divergence between the wisdom of this crowd and what the super forecasters think. We're going to get to find out who's right later in the year. So thank you very much for all of that. Appreciate it. And I hand back over to Phil.
Thank you, Warren. Okay. Yeah. Is my sound back on? Hello, everybody. I'm back. So there are 3 types of conversations. There are process gain conversations, there are process loss conversations, and there are neutral conversations. A process gain conversation is one where you sit down and you exchange arguments and you move closer to the truth. Right, so you get a better probabilistic accuracy score. Moving from 40 to 25%, you have a process gain if it turns out that the Fed does not change. It would be process loss, however, if the Fed does change, because you've moved from 40 to 25, you've moved further away from the truth. So it'd be a process loss conversation. And then you have process neutral, where you stay more or less the same. It turns out to be really hard for people to have process gain conversations. It's an interesting thing, but there are ways of doing it, and I hope that in the later interview part of the conversation, we can have a conversation about how to make conversation smarter, faster. Now, in the real world, it's very rare for high-status pundits and high-status people to make explicit probabilistic forecasts that can be gauged for accuracy. It's really unusual. The more common thing is what you see at, say, at a place like Davos, which I think is kind of the citadel of high-status vague verbiage forecasting. I challenge you to read this and even figure out what's being said, but this is from the Global Risks Report 2019. Right? And you can, it's amazing. Arguably, the cohesiveness of the multilateral system could be weakened by the creation of new parallel structures, but it's also possible that increased institutional density could bolster the resilience of the system. So there you go. So now you too can talk like a Davosian. Now, if you think I'm cherry picking, if you go through that report, you'll see that the word could appears 108 times, the word maybe occurs 29 times, possible occurs 26 times. And you might say, well, what's the harm in all of that? And there is considerable harm. The one harm is it makes it possible to learn to become better calibrated because nobody, even you, the forecaster, don't know what you're saying. And the other thing is that other people don't really know what you're saying. And we've done research on this, on vague verbiage forecasting, and how vague verbiage forecasting is, and it's really vague. You're running from a scale from 0, of course, to 100%. You shouldn't have probabilities over 1, or risky takes on, when you ask people, what does this word mean? What's the low, and you say, some readers think it could mean something as low as 11%, others think it could mean something as high as 83%. Real possibility could range from between about 22 to 89%. Distinct possibility, 21 to 84, could mean anything from about 2 to 56%. I think could actually be extreme tail risk. I mean, we could be struck by an asteroid in the next 10 minutes, at 0.0000, but it could happen in principle. Possible, some chance, probable. Anyway, you get the idea that vague verbiage is seriously vague. And it can cause serious miscommunication. There's a famous historical example that President Kennedy asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a second opinion about the feasibility of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. And they came back and they said it was a fair chance of success. And he interpreted that as optimistic. Later on, he discovered that the JCS intended it to mean, well, maybe we have 1 in 3 chance of working out. If people don't understand what the other party is saying when they're making risk assessments, it can cause bad decisions, and that's a problem. It also makes it impossible to learn to become better calibrated. You don't know when you're making an 80% probability judgment or a 20% probability judgment. It's mush. It's a big, mushy maybe zone. So what forecasting tournaments pressure you to do is to make more differentiated assessments of probability. Now, how many degrees of probability can ordinary mortals distinguish? Well, obviously, there's an infinite number of points between 0 and 1. And we know we can't distinguish an infinite number of degrees of, an infinity of degrees of uncertainty. We know we can't do that, but how many can we usefully distinguish? And the answer is more than you might think. The famous psychologist Kahneman and Tversky had a line in which they said, basically, people can distinguish 3 degrees of uncertainty. Most people, most of the time, distinguish 3 degrees of uncertainty. Yes, no, maybe. We find in our work that when people get practice making probability judgments repeatedly and getting feedback on their accuracy, they can distinguish 5, 7, 10, and the very best forecasters, the so-called super forecasters, can distinguish between 10 and 20 degrees of uncertainty for questions at the level of difficulty of those asked in the intelligence community tournaments. So it's certainly possible to do better than 3. Now, how much better can you get? Super forecaster teams were seeing things about as clearly 400 days out as the regular teams are seeing about 150 days out. So if you think of it by analogy to the Snellen eye chart. Now that doesn't mean they're not making mistakes, they're making lots of mistakes. But they're making fewer mistakes and they're achieving resolution on things more rapidly. Now we use I don't want to get into all the mathematics of probability scoring, but we use a system, a very widely used system for scoring probability judgments known as the Breyer-Scor's quadratic scoring rule. You essentially take the probability judgments people make and you deviate them from reality, where you score reality as 0 or 1. Now this means if you were omniscient, you would get a Breyer score of 0, which means there's a 0 gap between your probability judgments and reality, which means that whenever something happens, you say 100%. Whenever something does not happen, you say 0%. No human beings come remotely close to this level of accuracy. We don't live in a perfectly deterministic universe, and that is just not possible. A reverse clairvoyant would, of course, be someone who's always exactly wrong, who infallibly says that things will happen, assigns probabilities of 100% to things that don't, and probabilities of 0 to things that do. Such a person would, of course, be extremely valuable in the world of finance. In the middle of the Breyer scale, around 0.67, you have the proverbial dart-tossing chimpanzee that's throwing darts at random. You have the typical forecaster who's getting a Breyer score of around 0.39, and you have the super forecasters who are weighing in the Breyer score of about 0.14. On average, that means that when things happen, the super forecasters are assigning probabilities between 20 and 25% to them. Excuse me, when things don't happen, they're assigning probabilities of 20 to 25%. When things do happen, they're assigning probabilities of between 75 and 80%. So they're in the right ballpark. Now, there were 4 basic strategies we used in the forecasting tournament sponsored by the US intelligence community to improve judgment. And that was why the Good Judgment Project was able to prevail in those tournaments. That's how people like Warren were discovered. And that's some of the reasons why some organizations are restructuring how they go about foresight tasks. But the four key components of winning a forecasting tournament with the intelligence community were getting the right people on the bus, which is more or less a personnel selection function, debiasing training, giving people guidance on various categories of how to reduce the amount of noise and bias in judgment. Effective teaming, which is largely about having effective conversations. How can you have a more effective conversation that moves you in the right direction on the Fed question? And aggregation, which is, teaming is where you're aggregating in the human way, with your people talking to people. Aggregation is where the machines take over, and they're applying, they're computing various types of weighted averages, and they're modifying those weighted averages in proportion to various parameters like the diversity of the inputs, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But those are the 4 basic components of how to win a forecasting tournament. Identifying the right people, there was a personality profile for the very best forecasters, and it's not a very surprising one. They tended to display analytical rigor, good pattern recognition skills. They scored high on measures of active open-mindedness. They weren't embarrassed about admitting mistakes. And they had this thing called a growth mindset, which is another way of saying they thought that they were willing to buy into, at least in a tentative way, they were willing to buy into the assumption that maybe this thing, subjective probability forecasting, is a skill that can be cultivated and is worth cultivating. Because if you don't believe that, if you're not willing to buy into that and give it a shot, it doesn't really matter how high you are on analytical rigor and open-mindedness, you're not going to get better at it because you're going to stick with vague verbiage forecasting, and we know where that gets us. Now, Warren, these are some data that were collected by Good Judgment off the Good Judgment site.
Yeah, so there was a survey that was sent out in a link, and these are the results. The link is still live, so if you didn't get a chance or you want to do it again, you can still by all means go and do that. And what this is showing is the aggregated results from the people who did take it. Should I explain, or do you want to?
Well, these are essentially validated psychometric instruments that your human resources people could use if you wanted to screen people for foresight potential or things of that sort. Analytical rigor, which we're going to equate with pattern recognition. The first curve you're seeing here is, the first 3 curves are the super forecaster distributions.
Sorry, Phil, the other way around.
Oh.
So what we're seeing here is the results from the folks who took it here in the room.
Okay, so these are the CFA distributions. Okay, these are the CFA distribution, and okay, well, I can say this about it, that they're significantly above. You're scoring significantly above average on all of the good things. It's exactly between 1 and 2 standard deviations out. You're doing well, and some people are doing extremely well. The super forecasters are a little more extreme on analytical rigor, are almost identical in active open-mindedness, and they're a little more extreme on the cognitive reflection test. But these are all really, really good scores, and they are to some degree changeable. These are things you can improve your scores on. Here's an example. This is a classic test called Raven's progressive matrices, a measure of pattern recognition skills. It was used by it's really an old test. It's almost 100 years old. So it's almost as old as the San Francisco chapter here. The U.S. Air Force and the British Air Force used this to identify farm boys who had potential to be good pilots in World War II. So your task is to fill in the missing slot. You see that the box on the top has a missing pattern, and you're supposed to pick which of the 8 patterns below that best complete it. And I bet you all are going to guess number 8, and indeed that is the correct answer. This is one of the easier items. The Raven's regressive matrices can get really, really hard. It can get mind-bogglingly hard. But it actually proves to be one of the better predictors of super forecasting. So that's the first ingredient, is getting the right people on the bus. The second ingredient is training. And training features things we call, borrowing from Atul Gawanda's wonderful book on the Checklist Manifesto, debiasing checklists. So you want to strike the right balance between conflicting biases. You don't want to be overconfident, but you also don't want to be underconfident. Now, if you look at a lot of the research on forecasting, the dominant error, the most common error forecasters make is overconfidence. Like when people say they're 90% confident, things are often occurring only 60 or 70% of the time. So there's a miscalibration in that direction. Now, one way to fix that is you just hammer on people. You say, stop being so overconfident. Bang, 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 hammer. When you do that, you're at risk of generating the opposite error, of pushing them toward underconfidence. So the challenge in training is to get people to become well calibrated, not simply to oscillate back and forth between overconfidence and underconfidence. And that's what we aim to do in these training exercises, and we can talk in more detail later. But the key thing here is, as with the bicyclist, is practice, practice, practice. The other key thing, the other key factor that distinguished the very best forecasters in the intelligence community tournaments, and some of the others as well, is distinguishing between the inside view and the outside view. It's a term that Daniel Kahneman used in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The inside view is people who focus on the unique attributes of the case. The outside view is you're focusing on reference classes of similar cases. So here's the inside view. You're at a wedding, you look at the happy couple, you think you know them, you think that they're compatible, you think things are going to go really well, and someone has the bad taste at the wedding of asking you, well, how likely do you think it is they're going to stay married, they'll still be married 10 years from now or so? And you look at, you're offended, of course, it's a tacky question, and you respond somewhat indignantly, 95% or 99%. Well, this is not a good forecasting move. The dispassionate super forecasters say, well, what are the base rates and the relevant socio-demographic categories? And you say, well, it's about 37% divorce rate in this socio-demographic category. And then they say, well, what do you, then in addition to that, so that's the beginning of where they start. They don't start with a number like 95%, they start with a number like 35%, and then they start to adjust that number in response to the peculiarities of the members of the couple. So if they learn that the couple they're just wonderful, compassionate people who've known each other a long time and they've gotten along very well for a long time, you become more optimistic. If you learn that the groom is a psychopathic philanderer, you adjust your probabilities the other direction. So it's a combination of inside and outside view, but the best forecasters anchor their initial estimates in the base rates. And here's, of course, base rates in action with corporate mergers. It's, of course, an important part of business school folklore that corporate mergers typically disappoint. There are great expectations for what the mergers are going to deliver, and the mergers typically fall short. So just as with predicting the success of marriages, and similarly with respect to corporate marriages, you want to be wary to some degree. The third factor in winning a forecasting tournament, so getting the right people on the bus and the debiasing training, especially getting people to use base rates and getting people to become well calibrated and avoid under and overconfidence. The third thing is effective teaming. So you've probably all heard about groupthink, is when people get along too well in a group and there's a pushy leader and there's a lot of camaraderie and optimism in the group and nobody really wants to say anything very negative and people go off a cliff. versus analysis paralysis. I mean, if a group has too many naysayers, too many people second guessing, the group's not going to get anything accomplished, right? So you need to strike a balance between the cohesiveness of groupthink and the factionalism of analysis paralysis. And one of the key things here, and this is really a key ingredient for making conversations smarter, faster, making conversations have process gain, is learning how to disagree without being disagreeable. That was a phrase that was used at Intel a long time ago, constructive confrontation, and it's something that the very best teams learn to do. Then the fourth and the final driver of forecasting success is statistical. It's not so much psychological, it's statistical. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Zero Dark 30. It's been out for a while, but there's a wonderful scene in which the great actor James Gandolfini plays former CIA Director Leon Panetta, who's trying to find out from his analysts how likely they think it is that Osama bin Laden is residing in a particular compound in the Pakistani town of Abbottabad. And it's a great example of this dysfunctional team dynamics. We'll put the movie to the side because the Hollywood thing is false, not surprisingly. But there is some truth to it. But imagine that you're the CIA director and you're polling your analysts, and each of your analysts gives you the identical answer. And they give it to you, they write it down anonymously. And each of them says, Mr. Director, I think the probability of Osama being there is 70%. And each one says 70%, 70%, and they say this anonymously, and they haven't talked to each other. All right? What do you think? That's pretty interesting. Versus, well, let's go. Let me backtrack. You've got two different situations as a director of the CIA. In one situation, you have your analysts who are all giving you the identical estimate, but they're drawing on exactly the same information. Hence, that's why we have the 70 as the same color. In the other case, you have the analysts giving you 70% estimates, but they're drawing on different types of information. So one analyst is drawing on satellite reconnaissance, another analyst is drawing on cyber code breaking, another is drawing on human intelligence. And they haven't talked to each other, and they've arrived at their estimates completely independently. And in the other case, they've all have the same information, and they've reached 70% consensus. Okay? You've got the same estimates in both cases, 70% and 70%. Should the director be equally confident about the location of Osama bin Laden in these two situations, or should the director have greater confidence in one situation or the other? And what the aggregation algorithms tell us pretty conclusively is this. When people drawing on very different types of information reach the same conclusion, that tells you more than when people drawing on the same information reach the same conclusion. So you should be 70% really isn't 70% when the analysts are reaching that 70% via very different lines of reasoning and evidence. The 70% should be transformed by the algorithm into something like 80 or 90%. You should do something known as extremizing. And extremizing is what is described here. This is the log odds extremizing formula. And it's something you can only do if you have a large number of forecasts from a large number of forecasters. And the idea is you're going to extremize more aggressively in proportion to the cognitive diversity of the forecasters from whom you're drawing. So when there's a diverse group of forecasters, and who are agreeing, you have more warrant for extremizing than if it's a homogeneous group of forecasters. Now, there's an interesting story, but you can over-extremize. And there's an interesting story about the Trump election and Nate Silver that we'll talk about later. So these are the key argument I'm making here is that the seeds of forecasting skills can be planted. And there are different ways of cultivating them. You can learn by doing in forecasting tournaments. You can engage in debiasing training. You can create learning cultures within teams and learn to have constructive conversations. And then you can harvest all of that through carefully designed algorithms that extremize in proportion to the cognitive diversity of the inputs. I mean, the best algorithm is one that does three things. It takes the weighted average of the most recent forecasts of the best forecasters, and it makes them more extreme if the people who are agreeing are people who often disagree with each other. Or at least don't agree with each other that much. But if they're people who always agree with each other, it's as if you're talking to the same person over and over again. Okay, so those are the four key components of doing well in forecasting tournaments. There's an important issue, an important limitation of the work that's been done so far, and that is all the focus was on the forecasters and their skill in making probability estimates, and nobody was focusing on the creativity of the people generating the forecasting questions. And creativity in generating forecasting questions is really hard to measure. So, there's a joke about scientists that, they look for their keys under the lamplight because that's where the light is brightest, not where they drop their keys, right? So we study forecasting accuracy because we actually know how to measure forecasting accuracy pretty well. But do we know how to measure the creativity of forecasting questions? That's much harder. So that's one of the big challenges we're working on with Warren and others. Designing questions that address really important macro issues. So if you want to know, for example, whether, let's say, take a big Davos kind of question, like whether there's going to be a fourth industrial revolution that'll cause major dislocations in white-collar labor markets by 2040. That's a long way off. What kinds of things would you expect to observe in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years if we were on the trajectory toward that outcome in 2040? That proves to be possible. You can ask questions about, well, how likely are we to be, robotic spending in US is going to exceed some threshold value by 2019 or 2020. Driverless vehicles are going to be carrying around people for fares in major US cities by a certain target date. There will be major advances in medical diagnostics, and the IBM project to turn Watson into a medical diagnostician will actually make more progress, even though it's floundered initially. You see, you'll learn to ask questions that give you hints. And each of those questions by itself doesn't tell you whether the Davos 2040 fourth industrial revolution thing is right or not. But cumulatively, each of them captures a little part. And so you want to develop what we call probative question clusters, or more technically Bayesian question clusters, designed to, each micro question captures a facet of the big question you're interested in. So here we're focusing on the bigger issue, will the EU and the UK have a major breakdown in economic ties? And what sorts of things would you expect to observe if we're on a trajectory toward that outcome? So one of the things I would recommend is when you're running forecasting tournaments, you give really careful thought to populating the forecasting tournament with clusters of questions that tap into the larger issues you care about, the larger strategic questions you care about. Now, I recently did a paper with a former student of mine, Joe Cerniglia, that is going to appear in Journal of Portfolio Management, in which we address an issue I know that's probably near and dear to your hearts, and that is, well, how does all this forecasting accuracy stuff tie into, say, alpha? Are people who are better forecasters, as measured by their Breyer scores, are they more likely to get higher investment returns? And the first answer to that question is, well, it depends on how good you are as a question generator. You need to be asking the right questions. But what we were able to show in this paper is that using pretty conservative assumptions about how much it's possible to boost forecasting accuracy, and using very conservative assumptions, I think, about how much consistency it's possible to have in alpha, you would expect, all other things being equal, there to be a relationship between how well people score on Breyer and how well people score on alpha. In a sense, what you're doing, I mean, how do you know? I mean, there's, of course, a classic debate in finance is how consistent is alpha, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal of consistency in alpha. It's possible, and so one of the challenges is when you get alpha statistics, what's the relative role of skill versus luck in contributing to alpha? And the classic test of that is how much regression is there toward the mean over time. If it's purely a function of luck, you should expect that alpha in year 1 will be a 0 predictor of alpha in year 2. If there is a skill component, you're going to expect to see some degree of stability. What the Alpha-Breyer framework allows you to do is if you coordinate your forecasting questions with your investment decisions, you can assess more rapidly the degree to which alpha is driven by skill or luck. So you can assess whether or not someone who's got really good alpha at a given time is getting that really good alpha because he or she is making really accurate forecasts, or is actually getting really good alpha even though he or she is wrong about lots of things. So you could, for example, have predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the election in 2016 and the stock market would immediately boom after that. You would be wrong on the politics, but you'd be right on the finance. So you can be right or wrong on the politics or the finance. So you can have a 2-by-2 table. And Alpha-Breyer allows you to distinguish more rapidly who's right for the right reasons, and who's right because they're lucky, and who's getting bad alpha, and just but it's largely unlucky because they're actually making pretty good forecasts. In which case you'd expect them to do better going forward insofar as their stability in Breyer. At any rate, this is early work in the early stages, but I think we're cautiously optimistic that it could prove to be a useful diagnostic tool for firms in trying to disentangle skill versus luck components of alpha more rapidly than simply waiting to see who regresses toward the mean more or less rapidly than whom. So our advice is, keep forecasting at the good judgment site and the finance forecasting challenges that are hosted by the CFA societies. I've been consistently surprised by how much better people can get when they practice. And that's especially true for people who have the psychological profile in this room. I'm not claiming that good subjective probability forecasting skill is accessible to the general population. I don't really think it is that much. But I think it is accessible to people who have the sorts of scores you guys have on those tests. I mean, it is doable. And the challenge for you, I guess, is were you willing to follow through on it and test the proposition that you can get better at these things? And can you configure the forecasting tournaments in ways that make them maximally useful to your business decisions? Which is the challenge that we haven't fully addressed in our work yet, but is obviously critical for transforming Breyer scores into dollars.
Please welcome to the stage Jane Leung, Director at Large, CFA Society San Francisco, Board of Directors.
Good evening, everyone. I hope that you are enjoying the program as much as I am. I mean, I must say there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion at my workplace tomorrow when I start bringing out the probative questioning clusters. So I tell you, Dr. Tetlock has given us a lot to think about this evening, and I'm now pleased to be introducing the next part of the evening, and in particular, Deirdre Bosa, who will be digging into the topics even more deeply with Dr. Tetlock, and she will also be incorporating your questions, so get them ready. There's going to be volunteers that are going to be with mics, and we're going to do this in a very organized way. So we're very fortunate to have Deirdre with us tonight, as she's become, for many of us, a very familiar face during the workday, during her tenure at CNBC. For those of you who don't know Deirdre, she originally joined CNBC in 2012, covering the markets and economies of London and Singapore, and she has co-anchored morning programs including Squawk Box Asia, Squawk Box Europe, and Worldwide Exchange. And before that, Deirdre was based in Beijing with CCTV News International, based in Beijing, as well as a contributor to Fox Business News. So Deirdre rejoined CNBC in October 2016 as a technology reporter based in their San Francisco bureau, CNBC at One Market. And from San Francisco, Deirdre's beat includes tech giants such as Amazon and late-stage private companies like Uber, Airbnb, and WeWork. She's interviewed some of the world's key business figures, including Richard Branson and Justin Trudeau, and now Dr. Phillip Tetlock. I, for one, think this is going to be a really interesting, no, I predict this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Deirdre Bosa.
Hi, Phillip, and thank you all for having me here. This is exciting, and I was delighted when we did that exercise with Warren and Phillip. I've never seen a room get so excited about the Federal Reserve and raising rates, so clearly I feel at home here in good company. And you know, it was a fun experience because at least at our table, we had probabilities all over the place. I think I was actually the lowest at 10%. We had someone at 80%, and how we started is we picked the lowest and the highest and got that point of view. But you talked about this method of smarter conversation. What does that look like? What should we have been doing? What should have the tables been doing?
Making conversation smarter, faster is the most difficult research project I've ever taken on. It is really non-trivial. We've had a lot of false starts with this, a lot of things that didn't work very well. And I think we're now moving into a space where we're able to produce some replicable gains. So we can be reasonably confident that, you know, conversations that previously would have been process loss move to either process neutral or process gain. Now, how do you do it? Well, one simple thing is taking a Danny Kahneman heuristic and turning it on its head. He has something he calls attribute substitution, which he says is a common source of error. And people put way too much confidence in experts because, who are asked extremely difficult questions that they couldn't possibly know the answer to. But the expert offers an opinion, and people listen to it, and they say, well, you know, this looks like the sort of person who would know the answer to a question like this. So I'm going to infuse certainty into this judgment. Warren Buffett is saying this, or Bill Gates is saying this, or whoever it might be. And that's not irrational to be doing that. Except you're forgetting that you've switched the question. You're no longer asking the question, you know, is there going to be a global recession in 2022? You're answering the question, does this look like the sort of person who would know the answer to that question? And those are two, you should always keep very clearly separate in your mind what you're answering. So when you get a question,
are you saying though at our individual tables, when we take it to this example, the person who we think should know the most, we shouldn't think that. Someone who looks like they know what they're talking about, we should throw that out.
What you want to find out as quickly as possible is who knows more about the subject and give more weight to that person. It's a difficult thing to do. So who knows more about the Federal Reserve? Who knows more about the recent history of the Federal Reserve? Who knows more about inflation expectations? Who knows, who knows something about Jerome Powell? Who has the relevant pockets of information? So find out as quickly as possible who has that relevant information and give more weight to that person. It would be analogous to what you do in forecasting tournaments where you give more weight to better forecasters. You'd be giving more weight to people who know more about.
Professor, let me give you an example then, though. This is what we did on CNBC all November and December. And there were very different views on the Federal Reserve and what it would do than there are today. So we had experts come on, and a lot of folks agreed that maybe we would get continued rate hikes, and that didn't happen. So what happens when the consensus is wrong, as it so often is?
Well, here are a couple of things you can do that I think really do help. You want to make psychology work for you, and you want to make statistics work for you. You can make the statistics work for you better if you get everybody to make their judgments completely independently of each other, without talking to each other at all. Just get everybody to form an opinion. To make the psychology work better, you've got to have people sharing information, sharing arguments. But you can do it sequentially. So there's a technique known as Delphi, which helps to make conversation smarter, faster. And it works. You get about 10% improvement, which is non-trivial in my line of work. What happens is everybody in the group doesn't say anything at first. You get the Fed question, and you write down your estimate, and then you write down very succinctly your rationale for it. And then you share it around the table. So everybody share, but you don't know who said what. So you might have a high status person at the table. You don't want that high status person to bias things too much. So you want it all to be anonymous. So everybody gets to see what everybody's estimate was. Everybody gets to see what everybody's explanation was. But you already have what their pre-estimate was before that. And then you get to see how much people want to change their mind in response purely to the informational weight that's contained in the arguments that they've shared. Not in response to who's more extroverted and likes to talk more in the group. Extroverts tend to have more influence in groups, not surprisingly. Highest paid person in the room, that person tends to have more influence as well. Even if highest paid person in the room tends to be somewhat more accurate on average, you want that to be reflected in the strength of the arguments that are being presented, not in the fact that it's the highest paid person in the room. So the Delphi procedure does produce appreciable improvements in the intelligence of conversations because you're getting the best of the statistical side. You're getting statistical independence, and you get the wisdom of the crowd works better. You get the madness of crowds with contagion, right? Consensus, beware of consensus and groupthink. But you get the advantages of independence initially because everybody makes a judgment before they can contaminate each other. Then when they contaminate each other, it's more fertilization than contamination because they're sharing the best arguments they can muster, and they're able to just process those arguments as calmly and in isolation from each other. And then if you want, you can do another iteration, and everybody can see how much do you want to change your mind. So as we did here, people move from 40 to 25. You can do a Delphi and say, well, how much do people move? And then share your arguments again. You could do it, and you can keep doing that until you reach a Delphi convergence. Now, if it's a really important problem, you might want to do a Delphi do 3 or 4 Delphi iterations.
Now, you've talked a lot about how we get more accurate results, but why is it important to get those results? When we look at, on a larger scale, what we're looking at, liberals go to MSNBC, conservatives go to Fox News. It seems there's a lot of people out there who aren't interested in the best, most accurate forecast when sometimes the loudest people rise to the top. So what does that tell you about the need for super forecasting or society's willingness to embrace it?
Well, I think that people in a field like finance, where they get pretty clear and quick feedback on their judgments and they have skin in the game, tend to be appreciably more rigorous than people in politics, where they're making their judgments based on emotion and symbolism in large part. So I would draw a distinction between politics and finance. Now you can't create a Chinese wall between politics and finance, of course, because the two influence each other profoundly. So that's partly why I think that the forecasting tournament methodologies developed inside the intelligence community have potential usefulness here, because they suggest that it's possible to think more rigorously about politics than was previously the case. Mm-hmm. It's possible to bring some of the rigor that you see in finance into political reasoning.
And is that something that society wants to do, is my point, especially when you talk about politics. And you said, you did foreshadow that we were going to talk about Nate Silver and the Trump election. And Nate Silver said that there was a 70% likelihood that Hillary Clinton would win. And as we were talking about earlier, all the late night talk show hosts made fun of him for getting that so wrong. But Professor, you don't think he was actually wrong. Because you told me we're living in a 30% world.
We could be living in a 30%, yes. Well, that's what we talked about over at the dinner table, right? Yeah, it was a hard sell for Nate when he was on those TV shows, trying to persuade them that, yeah, we live in a 30% world. Something somewhat unlikely happened. My probability estimates are pretty well calibrated. I think it's instructive to compare what Nate Silver was predicting with what the other major poll aggregators were predicting. and he actually looks pretty good relative to them. Sam Wang at Princeton, his aggregation tool had 95% probability of a Hillary victory. And he was using a logic that's somewhat similar to what I was describing as extremizing. There was a lot of independent poll evidence that Hillary had an advantage. Nate Silver also had that data, and he was tempted to extremize as well, I think, but he throttled back. And this is where human judgment comes into play in an important way. I think he recognized that the risk of correlated measurement error. Recognized that if the polls are systematically underrepresenting Trump's support in key battleground states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, if the polls are doing that, if they're doing it in Wisconsin or Ohio, they're likely doing it in Michigan and Pennsylvania as well. So the measurement error could be correlated, in which case, if Hillary support starts to crumble in one state, it's likelier it's going to crumble in another. Now, the poll evidence did favor Hillary, and the polls have historically been the way to go. And there was a lot of evidence like that. But so you say, you could look at it a couple of different ways. Well, Nate Silver certainly did better than the other poll aggregators. He showed prudence in that sense, but he was still on the wrong side of maybe.
Isn't that what you would call a hedgehog thing, though, to find a way that your prediction is correct when...
Yes, right. Well, here's one way to do it. I mean, you say look, Nate Silver makes a lot of forecasts, not just in politics and sports and lots of things. And when he says things are 70% likely, do they happen about 70% of the time? Which, by the way, means they're not going to happen 30% of the time. So for Nate Silver to be well calibrated when he says a 70% probability, that means if you throw out a well-calibrated forecaster every time they're on the wrong side of maybe, you're not going to have any well-calibrated forecasters on your staff, right? You're going to fire them all way too fast.
So what I asked you then, I asked Professor if Trump's election was a black swan event. You said it was a gray swan event. So
I said light gray.
Light gray. So, tell us what you mean by that, and some things that are so unpredictable.
Well, black swans, by definition, are extreme tail risk events, and when people are assigning probabilities between 5 and 30% to a Trump victory, it's not an extreme tail risk event. Certainly, 30% is not an extreme tail risk event. I see predictability along a continuum, and there are classes of events that are so extremely rare and extremely high impact that they can greatly unsettle financial markets and political systems, and things happen. And it's extremely difficult to measure forecasting accuracy for those events. I think the best you can do is develop early warning indicators. I think there were early warning indicators for the 2008 recession. I think there were early warning indicators for the disintegration of the Soviet Union. There were early opportunity indicators for the rise of the internet. There were lots of extreme tail risk, both positive and negative events, for which you can develop tangible, shorter term clusters of questions that tap whether they're on the horizon or not, and transform the black swan into kind of a gray swan.
And I know you can't predict all of those events, but if we give a bigger platform to super forecasters, do you think that we'd be better prepared?
I don't want to present anything as being a panacea. I think that super forecasters are a very valuable reality check. I think it's useful to gauge how well your internal people compare to super forecasters, whether they're out-predicting or under-predicting super forecasters in certain domains. It was, I think, disconcerting that intelligence analysts were underperforming relative to super forecasters, given that intelligence analysts are providing, critical national security advice on, life and death matters. So I think, yes, it's a good idea to consult talented generalists. Talented, seasoned generalists, it's useful to consult them on these sorts of issues. They're a useful benchmark for checking your internal people. They're a useful benchmark, I think, for the media to consult occasionally.
now I know you brought up the example of intelligence officials. What about when we turn back to finance? I know we have lots of portfolio managers and investment professionals in the room, and every year we do this story where we look at the returns of active fund managers and hedge funds versus passive funds. And this is from last year, but it was 36% of active US stock fund managers outperformed their passive peers from June 2017 to June 2018. So just 36%. How do you justify paying fees when there's that kind of performance, and why do we continually do it? Not to offend anyone here in the room.
I think this issue of I'm familiar with the base rates and how difficult it is to achieve sustainable alpha. Mm-hmm. And I think the techniques that I was working on with Joe Cerniglia have some potential for helping us disentangle the skill versus luck components of alpha more rapidly. But the efficient market hypothesis I don't believe in the strong form of the efficient market hypothesis. I do believe that there are conditions under which intelligent trading strategies can outperform, but it's very difficult to find evidence for very consistent overperformance across time. This is a conversation that's not going to be resolved here. But I do think that joining the methodologies that I think there are many sources of unpredictability in the world. I think the sources of unpredictability, the macro sources of unpredictability that you can pick up in forecasting tournaments could be helpful to active managers in their efforts to outperform market benchmarks. But it's an empirical question. It hasn't been resolved.
I would say that, otherwise there'd be a lot of rich people and very good managers in this room. What are some actionable ideas then, especially when it comes to managing money or picking stocks, that, I think you were telling me about always comparing your results in the past to what you're looking at in the future. So what are some actionable items to become more of a super forecaster?
Beyond signing up for forecasting tournaments, and how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you become a better subjective probability forecaster? Practice, practice, practice. You get accustomed to being wrong. Get accustomed to being wrong over and over again, and living with it and learning from it.
Can you hold people accountable then? Is that something I was laughing at your
it's a
your scale, right? When you had maybe, less likely, and you were joking with me that I should put that up on CNBC because you do hear a lot of those words. My favorite is cautiously optimistic. But that doesn't really mean anything. But you hear it get thrown out so often, and I think sort of our jobs is to say, well, what do you mean by that? Give us something. Is that what you should be pushing people to do, or are you pushing them into a stance that they haven't researched yet?
You're right. This is a very difficult managerial question. For example, the intelligence community spent many tens of millions of dollars on forecasting tournaments, but they have not wholeheartedly embraced forecasting tournaments by any means. And it's pretty easy to understand why from a basic management point of view. So, imagine. I'm almost 65 years old now, but imagine I became a professor when I was young. I was 25, and so I've been a professor for basically 40 years. And imagine instead of going into academia, I'd gone to intelligence analysis, and I was a China expert. And I worked my way up the hierarchy. So after 40 years, I'm on the National Intelligence Council, and I contribute to the PDB, the Presidential Daily Briefing. And Trump's going to meet Xi Jinping. I'm sort of in the background and sort of in the middle of things important, right? So you've moved into a high status sort of role inside the organization. And some people from the R&D branch called IARPA say, hey, we want to run forecasting tournaments in which we assess whether 25-year-olds can predict as well as 65-year-olds who have a lot of seniority and status. How are the high status people likely to react to the idea that they're suddenly going to be put on a level playing field with these upstarts? It's not surprising, by the way, that younger people tend to be more enthusiastic about forecasting tournaments. So there's a resistance to them, and you have to be careful about how you interpret them. I think there are forms of wisdom that can't be captured in forecasting tournaments. So I'm not implying that forecasting tournaments are everything, but they are something. Mm-hmm. And there's something that's been neglected and hasn't been given adequate weight. But organizations are going to have to learn how to balance these things. I mean, there's something kind of ruthless about forecasting tournaments, and to get people to engage in the kind of cognitive activity they need to learn in forecasting tournaments, they need to feel psychologically safe. They don't need, in finance, you're already under a lot of performance pressure. All you need is more performance pressure still. Say, oh, we're not only going to be measuring your P&L, we're going to be measuring your Breyer scores now too, and we're going to be seeing how accurate you are on all these questions that are feeding into your investment decisions. We're going to be testing your accuracy on all of these as well. It becomes very burdensome. It creates an overload problem. I think to create an environment in which people learn and flourish from forecasting tournaments, you need to make them feel psychologically safe. It needs to feel like fun. It needs to, rather than, oh my God, you're cranking up the accountability pressure even more. I mean, in finance, there's a lot of accountability pressure.
Like our Fed conversation, I think that was, was fun. I would love to open it up to some questions. Are we ready for that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Just raise your hand, and I think there are some roving microphones. I think someone was asking one earlier and got cut off around here.
I found it really interesting about the extremification, and I was wondering if you flip that percentage and you got 30% from many forecasters, would extremification be going in the same direction?
Extremification would be, if it's a binary question, so maximum uncertainty would be at 50%, extremification would take 70% and move it up, say, to 85, or it would take 30 and move it down toward 15.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any specific recommendations for debiasing training outside of reading a book like Thinking Fast and Slow or something along those lines?
It's interesting you should mention Thinking Fast and Slow, because in some ways Daniel Kahneman is quite pessimistic about the prospects for debiasing. He has a wonderful section in that book where he talks about the analogy between cognitive biases and perceptual illusions. And he shows this perceptual illusion called the Mueller liar, in which two lines are identical in length, but everybody sees them of different length. And the only way to overcome the illusion is to pull out a ruler and measure the two lines and see for yourself that they're actually the same length. But from his point of view, many biases are as tenacious as perceptual illusions. They're wired into the human brain at a very basic level of processing. So it makes him pessimistic about the longevity of debiasing. I mean, we can do debiasing. We can teach you to pull out rulers and measure what's going on in certain classes of situations, but we can't teach you to see the illusion differently. It'll still look very compelling. I wish I could flash it up on the screen and you'd see it and you'd say, oh my God, I can't undo that. But I know it's true. So Kahneman, it's interesting. He is somewhat pessimistic about debiasing. I think he's more pessimistic about debiasing than I am. We developed a series of guidelines in the Good Judgment Project for training people. They weren't all debiasing guidelines per se, but they were guidelines for how to think more effectively under uncertainty. So there were 10 guidelines there, and they were summarized in the Super Forecasting book, and there's also the section at the end called the 10 Commandments. So I think those would be the first places I would recommend people would turn. How big an effect can you get from cognitive debiasing? Our effect sizes were between about 7% and 12%, I think, in years 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the first tournament. So, I mean, And that was from only 1 hour of training, which is kind of surprising you get that effect that would last throughout a tournament year.
Hello, Dr. Tetlock. My question is, I'm a fund manager, and occasionally I'll speak to institutions, and more they seem to want to just invest. If we have a strict algorithm, we can offer them and test and show them the results of that over time. Whereas the way we operate, we have models, and then we have a human overlay. Do you have a bias one direction or the other?
Well, I'm not a pure quant person by any stretch of the imagination. I come out of a more cognitive sort of tradition, which allocates some significant role for human judgment. But that said, I mean, most of the people in my field think that human judgment is deeply flawed and needs to be systematically monitored and often overridden by algorithms. I think the big question is, how are things going to evolve in the next 20 to 25 years? Are we going to need radiologists? Or are we going to be able to replace radiologists with algorithms? To mention a professional group that is somewhat close, I think, to being algorithmized. I mean, I don't think there's much of a case anymore for having people judge creditworthiness. Those sorts of judgments have long since been algorithmized. There are the kinds of things that we looked at with the U.S. intelligence community. I mean, what will Putin do in the Ukraine or in Estonia or in Syria, or what will Xi Jinping do in the South China Sea, or with respect to property rights or computer subversion? Those kinds of questions are extremely difficult for machines to get any traction. You can create very simple algorithms like predict no change or predict the most recent rate of change, but it's very difficult to. There are large categories of judgments and forecasts that machines aren't remotely ready to take on yet. And they mostly those are the sorts of questions that were being asked in the ARPA tournament, so it's very difficult for machines to take those on. Now, by 2040, you say, the Davos Fourth Industrial Revolution, strong forms of artificial intelligence will take over. Perhaps. IARPA does run hybrid forecasting competitions now, in which machine learning people try to beat humans and also try to design hybrids that combine the strengths of algorithms and the strengths of humans. So this is a work in progress. It's difficult to make big, bold generalizations about this. It's a fluid situation. It's changing. It's domain specific. There clearly are situations where the algorithms turn out to be based on data that don't take into account historical shifts, and they get blindsided, and that humans either could have or did anticipate. But there are also situations where humans try to meddle too much with the algorithms and reduce the predictive power of the algorithms. So you get we're experiencing both types of errors. And it's a great challenge. I think it's surprising when you look at the lines of work that super forecasters come from. I was surprised by the number of computer programmers in their ranks. I mean, tech people and finance people are definitely overrepresented in the ranks of the super forecasters. And the super forecasters are certainly not anti-algorithm. In fact, many of them invent their own algorithms. Some of them are pretty good at this stuff, and they're also pretty good at modeling, and they can run Monte Carlos and so forth. So it's not a clear separation between humans and machines. The best humans are using machines, and I think the best machines are using human judgment in various ways.
And to follow up on that, do you think that companies like Facebook and Google, when they're collecting huge amounts of data, are getting closer to that kind of artificial intelligence? It's going to be making machines eventually the super forecasters.
I think given the rate at which, it's hard not to be enormously impressed by some of the strides in machine learning like AlphaZero that it just keeps learning one major category of game after another extremely rapidly and outperforming everything. So it's very hard not to be impressed by that. But it's also important to note that we're talking about chess and Go, and we're talking about games with very well-defined rules and well-defined antecedent conditions.
And even Watson, right, on Jeopardy.
Well, Watson was a little different, and Watson was an impressive achievement, although it's floundered in the medical field now, at least temporarily.
And Watson is the robot that beat everyone in Jeopardy, built by IBM.
Yeah. Also, I don't know if you remember when the Watson was playing in Jeopardy. It would buzz in faster than the humans and come up with the right answer more rapidly than the humans, obviously, because it won decisively. But there would always be underneath its answer a probability. Say, I'm 0.9996 confident that Charles Dickens wrote Tale of Two Cities, or whatever. But sometimes Watson would offer lower levels of confidence than that. But it's interesting. Watson would never say 1.0. Watson was a good.
He's never entirely sure.
Watson was a good Bayesian. would avoid doing that.